Well, welcome everyone. I am so glad that you are here today to join us for June's Wednesday webinar. Today's topic is FAFSA Simplification. I'm Mila Tappan and I will be your presenter. And with me today, thankfully, is Nikki Vachon. And Nikki will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. So as you have questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in that. What we're going to do today is I will stop probably once or twice, but we have so much content that I want to be sure we get that out there. If there's something that Nikki feels like I need to address because there's, it's something that's applicable to everyone or there's some confusion, she can always jump in. I appreciate you doing that, Nikki, if need be. Otherwise, we'll answer questions at the end. And if we don't get all the questions answered, I'll put them in writing because there will be a follow-up email that will have a link to this recording in case you need to leave early or you want to listen again or share it with friends. So that will have the link to the recording as well as the answer to any of the questions that we don't answer during this session. And I can tell you right now, without even starting, before I've even started, there are going to be questions that we don't know the answer to yet, but that we hope that we will learn soon. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So here's what we're going to focus on today. First, we're going to do just a really brief overview of what today's FAFSA looks like and how things work, because that sets the stage for the changes. If, we have people who don't know exactly how it works now, I think how it's going to work in the future won't make as much sense. Then we'll share a few of the changes that are already in place with the 23-24 FAFSA, but then we'll spend the majority of our time focused on what's coming with the 24-25 FAFSA. And then last but not least, we'll share some resources that are available to help everyone kind of get prepared for all of this. So the way I would like to start today is by doing a quick poll of all of you. Actually, two very, very quick polls. So I'm going to do the first one here. And the first one is just trying to get a sense of how familiar you are with the current FAFSA. Because I don't want to go into too much detail. If you're all, pretty familiar with it, I'll just hit the highlights. Okay, great. Got almost everyone having responded. So, so that's great. It looks like the majority of you are familiar with the FAFSA. Don't consider yourself an expert or a novice, but very comfortable with the FAFSA. So that is fabulous. And now I am going to launch the second poll, which is going to ask you how familiar you are with the upcoming FAFSA simplification changes. Hopefully it will help me hit that right level of detail for what all of you are looking for and needing. Okay, so what we're seeing is about 55% of you are familiar with it to some extent, but we have a good portion, about 37% who aren't really very familiar at all. And then a small handful who are very familiar. So that is super helpful. So I will keep that in mind as I'm discussing these changes and hopefully try to hit that middle ground for all of you. All right, so let's start by talking about today's FAFSA. Again, just because I think it really helps us to talk about how it is now, because then we can talk about how it's going to be. So one of the key pieces when it comes to the FAFSA, the first big step in filing the FAFSA is to get an FSA ID created. So kind of know what an FSA ID is for, and then to get them created. So probably everyone is familiar with the fact that the FSA ID is that username and password that students set up and parents set up, and it's used to access all of the federal student aid websites, and it's how the FAFSA is signed as well. FSA IDs get created at studentaid.gov. And it is recommended currently that students and parents get their FSA IDs ahead of time. Now, here's one of the big things that we're going to be talking about as we go forward today. This is how it is currently, because you can get an FSA ID and then immediately use it to file a FAFSA, and that's going to be changing. So we're going to talk more about that. But the way that it works currently is you can do both of those things all at, one right after the other. It is critical and remains critical that when people create their FSA ID, that they enter the correct information as it is on their social security card, especially their name, social security number, and date of birth. Those have to match the Social Security Administration information, because your FSA ID or your students or parents that you're working with, their FSA IDs have to match what's on file with the Social Security Administration. If they don't, then their FSA ID is not going to work. So it's really, really super important. We created a form years ago when FSA IDs became a thing, used to be a PIN. And I think it's been 8 years now that we've had FSA IDs. So we've had a form where people can write down their information associated with their FSA ID creations, because the FSA ID needs to be used for years to come. So being able to year after year after year, remember what the information was, or at least know how the ways that you can retrieve it, is absolutely critical. Unlike my Apple ID, right? I have 2 Apple ID accounts because one got so messed up, I just threw in the towel and said, I have a second email, I'm gonna create a second Apple ID. We can't do that with FSA IDs because they're tied to our Social Security number and we only have one. Okay, so that's a little bit about the lowdown on the FSA ID and how it exists currently. Now, when it comes to the FAFSA currently, probably everyone here is very familiar with the FAFSA that can be filed at FAFSA.gov. Technically, that takes you over to studentaid.gov, but the FAFSA is what's opens the door to all federal grants, work study, federal loans, as well as here in Maine. That's how you access the Maine State Grant. And for students who are in the graduating classes for the last several years, including 2023, the FAFSA is how they access free community college. Additionally, here in Maine, most colleges use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for their own institutional money. Now, the current FAFSA, this is the last slide, we're going to talk about the current one, but the current FAFSA has 7 sections. And what happens with the current FAFSA is you have to complete one section before you can go on to the next section. But all within that one FAFSA, you're going to see that you have your student information and then your parent information and then back to some student information. As we talk about what's coming, I think it's important to know that this is how it currently works because this is not how it's going to work in the future. And then just one last thing, dependent students need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. There are a bunch of our students, though, who are independent. A student is automatically considered to be independent when they meet any of this bulleted criteria. The good news is that's not changing. So there are no changes coming to the dependency status criteria, but I just wanted to lay that out for you as we talk about it today. I think it's always important to share the fact that so often students' difficult and complicated situations are often built into the FAFSA already. And so just a reminder, I think always of, if you've got students who have been in foster care or homeless, actually filing the FAFSA is going to be even easier for them because if they're independent, they don't need any parent information on the FAFSA. Okay, so that's the current FAFSA, just a very high level of kind of, how it works and what it looks like and what the scoop is with FSA IDs. Anything, Nikki, before we move on that you think is critical to address? Great. So now let's talk about FAFSA simplification. So the impetus for FAFSA simplification actually comes from 2 different acts that the federal Congress passed and the president signed. The first is the Futures Act, which actually came first in 2019. And what the Futures Act did was it expanded access to federal student aid and mandates that federal student aid use IRS data that comes directly from the IRS. Now, you're going to say we already had an IRS data retrieval tool, but that's changing. And instead, information is going to come directly from the IRS. And that triggers a lot of different changes, which we're going to touch on as we go through today. Then the other big act that impacts all of the stuff we're talking about today is the actual FAFSA Simplification Act. And that passed in 2020. Both of these were part of those big omnibus bills at the end of the calendar year that had all sorts of stuff in them. So the FAFSA Simplification Act was what is causing a lot of these changes to happen. Originally, it was supposed to be in place for the 23-24 year, but it was the vast majority of changes have been pushed off until the 24-25 year. And at the time, it seemed like that was so far away, but now it's almost upon us. So those are the big things that we are dictating all of these changes that are coming to the FAFSA. So as mentioned, the changes were supposed to all take effect in 23-24, but it was delayed. The majority of them have been delayed to 24-25, but there were a few that they felt like they could make more immediately. And so they are in place for the current year, okay? So for the 23-24 FAFSA, the one that's been being filed since October of last year, there was no longer a question that asked about selective service or drug convictions. That's totally gone, not to be seen again, we hope, okay? Totally gone from this year's FAFSA and will not be part of the FAFSA going forward. Additionally, what they did this year is they stopped asking whether a student is, male, female, any gender-related questions. They took those off the FAFSA for this year, and they were part of a post-application survey, and the information is not shared with us. So like in the past, we've been able to tell what percentage of FAFSA filers were male and which ones were female. We cannot do that any longer, unfortunately. But next year, those questions will actually be part of the regular FAFSA again. Another thing that I just want to highlight, and there are many things I'm not highlighting today. I'm really just kind of focusing in on what I think is most important to all of you. But one of the changes is that the process is becoming easier for homeless students. One of the primary goals of FAFSA simplification is to make it easier for students who don't have that typical, intact family and have access to all of the information they need. So homeless students in particular have been a group that the federal government and federal student aid in particular over the last several years have trying to reduce barriers for. So one of the things that's going to happen and is currently happening is for homeless youth, there are 3 questions on the current FAFSA. Those questions are carrying forward, okay? So if a student indicated that they were homeless when they did their renewal this year, those questions were already answered yes for them. They carried forward. And this is a really good positive thing, because what had been a challenge for students who were homeless is what happens after they graduate from high school. So their high school counselor could, or their high school's liaison could document that they were homeless, but what happens when they are no longer in high school? So the assumption is going to be going forward that if it was documented that you were homeless, that status continues unless the student indicates that it has changed, or unless there's conflicting information that the financial aid office becomes aware of. So this might not seem like a really big deal, but I think for those individual students in this situation, this is a really, really great change. Also, on the topic of homeless students, the guidance released on November 3rd. So what the federal student aid does periodically is they release this document called a Dear Colleague letter. And it's basically guidance as to what financial aid offices and others have to do to implement the rules and regulations. And so this guidance that came out in November indicated that now the director of a TRIO program or their designee can also document that a student is homeless. So in the past, the only people that could document that were the high school liaison, the homeless liaison, or the people who were the director of a U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development program, or the director of a runaway or homeless youth shelter. So what we had is we had a situation where, the students might not have contact with any of those, or be in a situation where those people were the appropriate people to be able to document their situation. So adding the TRIO director or their designee, or Gear Up, if we get another Gear Up grant, just means that there's that many more people who can say, hey, this is what's going on with this student, and make it a little bit easier for these students to get through the process. Now, that being said, if a student goes and files a 23-24 FAFSA today, they are not going to see that option because it happened after the release of the FAFSA. But a financial aid office can work with the student to get them through this process. A couple of other changes for the current FAFSA. And some of these you might be like, geez, are these really that important? But there's a reason why I think the ones that I'm sharing are. And one of them is that there are revisions to what we call the cost of attendance. So what every college does is they put together a budget, what it costs a student to attend, what's the cost of attending that particular school. And so one of the things that Dear Colleague letter in November said is that going forward, colleges need to make publicly available anywhere they talk about what their tuition and fees are, they need to either provide the full cost of attendance or provide an easy link to the full cost of attendance. Why is this a big deal? There are so many students out there who don't realize that the cost of attendance includes all of these other expenses and that financial aid can potentially help them cover those other expenses. So lots of times students are like, okay, maybe I can get my tuition and fees covered, but my real issue is where do I live? How do I get back and forth? Those are major issues. So by putting that information wherever tuition and fees is, it communicates subtly that, you know, not only does the school recognize that you have tuition and fees costs, but also these other expenses, and that financial aid theoretically is available to students who are eligible to help cover those expenses. So I think that's an important message. Additionally, room and board is now going to be known as food and housing. The meaning is the same. Basically, everything is the same. It's still included under that kind of living expense category. But again, this is important because I know over the years, I can't imagine how many times I've gotten the question of, okay, I lived on campus my first year. That's great. I got financial aid to help me with that. What happens if I move off campus? So these subtle changes are a way of communicating to students and parents that whether you live on campus or off campus, those costs are taken into account and financial aid is potentially available to help students pay for those expenses. We don't want students thinking that they can't make it happen if indeed there are ways that they can make it happen. So these are ways of communicating this to them more clearly. And then the last thing I want to talk about related to 23-24 is this category of professional judgment. So as I mentioned, one of the goals of FAFSA simplification is to reduce barriers for certain populations. So as we discussed earlier, you know, many students with these challenging circumstances find that those are already built into the FAFSA, right? So they can, if they're homeless, if they've been in foster care since the age of 13, if they're in the legal guardianship of someone else, they're automatically independent. So that's great. That's going to make the FAFSA process so much easier for them. But we know that there are still situations that aren't addressed by the FAFSA. So to deal with those situations, financial aid administrators, and we have several of those on this webinar today, have what's called professional judgment. And that professional judgment allows them on a case-by-case basis to take into account those student situations that aren't clear from filing the FAFSA. I have always, having worked in financial aid for more years than I'm willing to admit today, have always thought of professional judgment, special circumstances as being kind of the same thing. I always kind of put them under that one umbrella. What the feds have done more recently is they have said, you know what, we're going to break those two things apart. And this makes sense. I think this makes a lot of sense because they really are two different things. So financial aid people can use professional judgment to recognize special circumstances. And what that now is referring to is financial situations that have changed potentially based on it's not what's on the FAFSA. So for example, if someone loses a job, they have to put the year of information, tax information on the FAFSA that's required. But if they've lost a job, that's not reflective of their current situation. So that's a special circumstance. And a financial aid administrator can go in and make an adjustment with proper documentation to reflect that. You know, maybe there's been a divorce and now there's only one parent, but they filed a married tax return. Those are all what we refer to as special circumstances. Then there are what they are now defining or categorizing as unusual circumstances. And so this refers to the conditions that justify an aid administrator to make what we've always referred to as a dependency override. So those are those situations where students aren't independent, but yet they still can't provide parent information. Maybe their parents are still alive, they're not in foster care, they're not in legal guardianship, but maybe the parent is in prison. Maybe the parent has a drug issue and the student is not in contact with them because it's not healthy or safe for the student to do so. A financial aid administrator can, again, with documentation, do an override and say, yep, you know what, based on your circumstances, it is appropriate for you to be considered independent and not have to provide parent information. Again, I'm sharing this because it's so important, I think, to make sure that those students out there know that there is a way for them to get through this process. And I'm also sharing it because one of the things in that Dear Colleague letter from November is they have made it a little bit easier and are being more flexible about the requirements that allow financial aid people to make that decision and to do dependency overrides and to take into account all of those unique circumstances. So for example, not doing a deep dive here, you can see the Dear Colleague letter where if you want to read the details, but for example, a phone call now can be documented and serve as documentation for a financial aid professional to make that decision. If you haven't lived in the world of financial aid like Nikki and I have, and many others that are maybe in our audience today, the idea of a phone call being documentation is not what we were used to. We always wanted paper, someone to write us with a piece of paper because we got audited every year. We'd always be like, oh my gosh, I got to be able to be sure I did the right thing. But the feds have relaxed a little bit when it comes to these circumstances and are being a little bit more flexible, again, because these students already face so many barriers that we want to be sure that they can get through this process. All right, I'm going to leave it there for 23-24. There are some other changes as well, but those are some of the ones that I just wanted to be sure that people knew about. Nikki, any questions we need to address specifically before we move into 24-25?
Just quickly, there was one question in the chat that the homelessness questions are going to be coming forward from 23-24 to 24-25. That's the year specific, and it's going to be the answers will be preloaded.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. That's it.
Okay. All right. So 24-25, it's coming at us. So Federal Student Aid has launched this campaign, and they're referring to it as Better FAFSA, Better Future. So when you see Better FAFSA, Better Future, they're talking about FAFSA simplification, all the changes that are coming. We are trying to use Better FAFSA as well because we want to be sure that you and we, everybody understands that these are really, we're talking about the same thing. And I like the intention to say this is going to be a better FAFSA. It's going to be easier for students to get through this process. And the goals are to make the application more streamlined, to have a better user experience, to expand eligibility for federal student aid. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And also, as mentioned, to reduce the barriers for some of those populations who have struggled most. We know that FAFSA has always been a balance between getting schools the information they need in order to decide how to spend their funds, or the federal government's funds, or the state of Maine's funds, but at the same time, not have a barrier that prevents a student who in every other way is capable of completing college and getting, the skills that they need from being able to attend. So this is supposed to, rebalance things a little bit and ensure that students can navigate that process. So hopefully you've already heard that the FAFSA is delayed. So not only did they move it from the 23-24 to the 24-25 FAFSA, but instead of being available on October 1st, which has been the case for years, it is going to be delayed until December. We do not have the date in December in which it will be released. It could be the 1st, it could be the 31st. As soon as we know, you will know, because we will put the information on our website and spread it in other ways. And I think everyone will be doing that. So I think that will get communicated. I'd love to think over the summer we would know this, but no one's given us a date when we will know for sure. This is for 1 year only. So for the 25-26 FAFSA, we'll go back to October 1st. So this is not a permanent change. This is just a one-off because of how much it's taking for them to revamp this whole process. Now, for any of you who are using the CSS profile, or you're working with students who are going to need to file a CSS profile, that will still be available on October 1st of 23. Okay, so the CSS profile will still be available on the regular schedule that it has been for the last several years. So one of the things that's probably also made its way around is that the EFC is going goodbye. The EFC is going to become the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. We all know that that EFC term is misleading. The expected family contribution is sometimes less, more often it's more. So we don't want people relying on that as they're trying to figure out what their plans are going to be. So the SAI is replacing that, and hopefully will be a term that will cause less confusion. Just for the heck of it, I want you to know, if you didn't already, that the EFC, before it was the EFC, was called the SAI. So what's old is new again. The SAI can be as low as a negative $1,500, but what we have learned is that that doesn't mean, for the financial aid people, you probably already have heard this, it doesn't mean that you can go over the cost of attendance or you can go over the student's need. The real value of the SAI being a negative number is just to help financial aid officers and others distinguish between their really needy 0 EFCs or 0 SAIs and their super, super, super needy SAIs at a negative number. So it's not going to mean that they can get more aid in total. It just means it'll help them prioritize, which students, if they have some available money, who they might want to give that to. The SAI will be used to determine eligibility for all federal financial aid funds, except for minimum and maximum Pell Grant awards. And guess what we're going to talk about now? We're going to talk about Pell Grants, so that this last bullet will make some sense. Now, when I was putting this together, because we've done a couple of these presentations already, I was thinking, do I put Pell Grant stuff here or do I put it at the end? I decided I wanted it right up front. And the reason that I want it right up near the front is because this is such a positive change, and I want to start off on a really, really positive note. And I think this is something we can be talking about, and we can be using this information now. So the way that a Pell Grant is determined, eligibility for a Pell Grant is determined, is going to be expanding. So what's going to happen is there are going to be 2 pathways to determine Pell Grant eligibility. The first is very similar to our current situation that uses an SAI. So what's happened in the past for years and years, ever since I've been working in financial aid, if I know a student's EFC, I knew how much their Pell Grant was. Okay, that will continue. If I know a student's SAI, I'm going to know how much Pell Grant eligibility they might have. But what's been added to that is a second formula, which basically, let's say, it overlays that current formula that's existed for years. And that second formula is going to be based on the poverty line tables. So this is a really big deal, because what this means is there is going to be a way before a student ever files a FAFSA to know whether or not that student looks to be eligible for a Pell Grant. So can you imagine what a game changer I think it can be if we can say to a student and family when the student's in middle school or early high school, hey, based on your family circumstances, you're going to be eligible for a Pell Grant, or everything indicates that you're going to be eligible for a Pell Grant. I think that's really going to be a big, big deal, and hopefully open the door to more students who think that they don't have a chance of going to college because they can't afford it. So what's going to happen is these poverty tables are going to be used to determine the maximum Pell and the minimum Pell. And it will be based on the student's dependency status. It'll be based on the number of parents in that household and the family's AGI. And I could do a whole, and for a matter of fact, at FA 101, we really went into the weeds on this. So I'm going to share the link to our FA 101 sessions, just so you can see all of them and any that are of interest to you. But we did go into more detail on the Pell stuff. But today I'm just going to really hit the highlights. But I think what's important to know is that a maximum Pell will be available to people who have an AGI potentially as high as 225% of poverty. And a minimum Pell Grant will be available to those who have an AGI up to 400% of poverty, depending on their family size and dependency status and some things like that. Now, what's going to be helpful is, I hope, when I send the email, they have what they're calling the Pell lookup table. So I'm going to send you the tables that the federal government put out recently. So what you could do is, if you yourself were interested, or you're working with a student family and you have information on their dependency, their size of their family, the number of people in the household, and their adjusted gross income, you're going to be able to look and see whether or not it looks like they're eligible for a maximum Pell or a minimum Pell. So I'm going to send that information, but I think this is a real big deal. So again, just really briefly, how it's going to work is a student will be considered for a maximum Pell first. There are a couple of ways that students would be eligible for maximum Pell, those poverty tables being a way that many people will be eligible for maximum Pell. But another change that's coming is that anyone who is a non-tax filer, so let's just say in the case of a dependent student, if their parents are non-tax filers, or if they're an independent student and they're a non-tax filer, they will automatically be eligible for the maximum Pell. Also, some students who are in a situation where their parent was killed in the line of duty or in a military combat situation, they will be eligible under the right circumstances for maximum Pell. So it's really going to expand the students who are eligible for a maximum Pell. But if a student doesn't qualify for a maximum Pell, they'll look at their SAI. And I love this, and I know the financial aid people are going to love this too, is it's going to be easy to tell you how much Pell a student's going to get. Currently, we have a chart, and we have to look up on the chart what the EFC is and figure out what the Pell Grant amount is. Going forward, as long as we know what that maximum Pell is, let's just say for today's conversation, it's not, but I'm going to make it this today. Let's say the maximum Pell is $7,500. It's almost that. Let's say it's $7,500 and a student's SAI is $500. They're going to get a $7,000 Pell Grant. So that's going to make it so much easier to communicate this to students. The minute they file their FAFSA and submit it and we see their SAI, we're not only going to be able to say to them, you look like you're eligible for a Pell Grant, but without a chart beside us, we're going to be able to tell them how much based on that that current situation. Now, verification and all that aside. If a student doesn't qualify for a maximum Pell, and they don't get a Pell because of their SAI, let's just say it's over that 7,500 in this imaginary situation, then they're going to be considered for a minimum Pell Grant. And the minimum Pell Grant will be 10% of the maximum Pell Grant. So again, in this 7,500 scenario, the minimum Pell is going to be $750. So no test on this. I want you to be aware of that. There's not going to be a test after this for you to figure this out. But what I want to convey, because again, this is why I did the survey at the beginning, because I wanted to get a sense of, I had people, on what level of understanding of this. So if you've never heard about this change, what I just want your takeaway to be is that Pell has been expanded. There's information on, that I certainly can share with you as to in what details, and that this is a really good thing, and more people are going to be eligible for a Pell Grant. And it's going to be easier to figure out how much Pell Grant a student is eligible for, and we're going to know it earlier. So that's the big takeaway. Anyone who wants to go into the weeds, I'll send you a link to the presentation and from FA 101, or call me. Hey, I'm always glad to talk about this. All right, Nikki. Yes,
yeah, just real quick.
Yep.
Question, is the amount going to be impacted by level of enrollment? I think that we're
Yes.
talking about part-time, full-time.
Yes, it will be affected by the level of enrollment. And a change that's coming to that is it's going to be proportional. So again, getting a little bit in the weeds here, but before what we had is we had half-time, three-quarter time, full-time. So if you were, say, at a traditional school where 12 credit hours a semester was full-time, you got the same Pell whether you were 9 credits, 10 credits, or 11 credits. Now what it's going to do is it's going to do it proportionally. So it's going to take 9 divided by 12 and multiply that times the Pell Grant amount. So a student taking 9 credits will get a little less than a student taking 10. And a student taking 11 will get a little bit more. So yes, it will still be based on enrollment, but calculated slightly differently. Okay. Logically, actually, I think all of this, these changes, at least most of them, I think are just making things simpler and more straightforward. All right, so now, just keeping a check on time, now let's talk about how the process is going to work for a moment. So, there's changes to the form, there's changes to the questions, and then there are changes to the process itself. One of the reasons that I wanted to share how the FAFSA looks now is because I knew I was going to get to this piece. And so now the FAFSA is one form, students fill out their part, parents fill out their part, students fill out the remaining stuff, and they both kind of work on the same form together. That is not how it is going to be going forward. Instead, the FAFSA is going to become a roles-based form. And basically, they're going to be segments to one FAFSA. So each individual providing information on the FAFSA will only see questions related to their role. So again, we have not seen this ourselves yet either, but what we understand is when a student logs in, they're going to see information about themselves, their demographic information, where they went to high school, which colleges they want the information sent to. They're going to answer their dependency status questions, provide their income information, etc. Okay? But what they won't see is any of the questions about their parents' income or any of that. Conversely, parents won't see the students' questions. So as a parent, if I log in to a FAFSA, what I'm going to see is information about me, my spouse, our income information, our asset information. Okay. So basically, we're only going to see information related to our role in the FAFSA completion process. Now, there's a piece of new terminology. There's several pieces of terminology that are changing, SAI, but another one, and I don't love this, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, is that everyone who provides information on the FAFSA will be referred to as a contributor, okay? So when we hear the term contributor, my concern is that contributor simply means that they're providing information or they're required to provide information. A contributor is never required to contribute to paying for their students' education. But I do have concerns that people are going to hear contributor and make that leap. So I think we're going to try really hard in our communications, and hopefully all of you in your communications reassure students and families that when they see the term contributor, it only means a contributor of information. So who are some potential contributors on a FAFSA? It might be only a student, an independent student who's not married. The only contributor is the student. For a dependent student, it's going to be the student and a parent and maybe another parent. So no parent two anymore. It's going to be not parent one and parent two. It's going to be parent and other parent. And if it's a student who is an independent student and they're married, then their spouse's information or their spouse might be a contributor to the FAFSA as well. Okay, so we've got 4 sets of potential contributors, but it depends on the student's situation. Now, whoever starts the FAFSA, because our understanding is the student can start the FAFSA and do their section. The parent can start the FAFSA and do their stuff. Whoever starts it first is going to list the other contributors. So, for example, let's say I'm the student and I'm filling out the FAFSA, and I know that I have to provide parent information on the FAFSA. Then on my section of the FAFSA, I'm going to list my parents. And I'm going to list their name. We're understanding we're going to have to list name, date of birth, social security number, and email address. And guess what's going to happen? It's kind of like with the profile. That other contributor is going to get an email and say, hey, come on, go ahead, fill out your section of the FAFSA. If the parents start it, then they're going to list their students' information. That's going to be a little bit easier, probably, because they probably know that. They're going to provide their students' information. Their student will get an email, and they'll be invited to complete their section of the FAFSA. Okay, so again, process is going to be quite a bit different than how it's been previously. Which leads me to who is going to be a parent on the FAFSA. And there's just a slight tweak here. This is not a major change, but there is a change in the definition of a parent. So currently, a dependent student's parents, if they're divorced or separated, if they're married, if the parents live together, both parents, if they're divorced or separated, the student has been providing the information, or the parent who's required to fill out the FAFSA is the parent the student lived with most the last 12 months. That was the criteria, okay? Whichever parent they lived with most, that was the parent who provided information on the FAFSA. Starting with the 24-25 FAFSA, it's going to be the parent who provides the greater portion of the student's financial support. Okay. Now, I bet most of the time, the parent who is the students living with most is probably the parent that's providing most of their financial support, but maybe not always. So we could have some students who are currently in college who use one parent this year and we use a different parent next year. Okay. So with slight tweak there. If that parent, once we've identified which parent is filing the FAFSA, it's going to be the contributor. If that parent is married, their spouse's information will be required as well. That's not new. That's not a change. That's always been the case. But I think it's important to restate that because people are often caught off guard if they aren't familiar with how the FAFSA works when they realize that their spouse has to provide information as well. All right, now I want to talk about FSA IDs. And again, laid a little bit of groundwork in the beginning so that as I talk about these things, you can see kind of what's the same and what's different. So the FSA ID is going to be required of anyone who's trying to access the FAFSA. And depending on what you've done with FAFSAs, you might say, isn't it already that way? Well, no. The student could log in, or anyone could log into the student's FAFSA with an FSA ID, with a student's FSA ID. But let's just say I'm the parent and my student isn't around and I don't have their FSA ID. Currently, what I could do is I could log into a FAFSA using their demographic information. That is no longer going to be the case. So when a student logs in to do their FAFSA, their portion of the FAFSA, they're going to log in with their FSA ID. And again, they'll only see questions related to themselves. As a parent, when I log into the FAFSA, I'm now logging into the FAFSA with my FSA ID, and I will only see questions related to me as a parent. So again, that's a process change. That's going to feel very different for people who are used to doing the FAFSA. Now, one question that has come up is who will need an FSA ID under what circumstances? So the student always will, and if the student is dependent, one parent at a minimum always will. If the student's parents are married and file a joint tax return, there is still only the need for one parent to have an FSA ID. So my kids are old enough now that they're all independent, but if I was doing my kids' FAFSA, I'm married, my husband and I file a joint tax return, I could still do the whole parent section and my husband wouldn't need to log in and he wouldn't need his own FSA ID. But if parents are married and file separately, which some married couples do, or if parents live together but aren't married and file separate tax returns, both of those parents are going to need to have an FSA ID and are going to need to log in with their own FSA ID into the parent section of the FAFSA. Okay. I'm going to take a moment, let that sink in, because that's a big change. Another big change related to the FSA ID is that the FSA IDs are going to need to be matched ahead of time. Currently, when Nikki and I go and we go to a FAFSA help session in the fall, if someone shows up and they don't know anything about the process, they can create their FSA ID that night and immediately file the FAFSA that night. That is not going to be the case. People are going to have to get FSA IDs ahead of time because they need to be matched with the Social Security Administration before they are valid and can be used. And that typically takes 3 days. So we need people to get FSA IDs ahead of time. They can still come to any of our sessions or any of your sessions, but if they haven't done anything, all they'll be able to do that first night is to create their FSA IDs. They will not be able to immediately go and file their FAFSA. They're going to have to wait for those FSA IDs to be verified with the Social Security Administration first. Now, because of these changes, we have updated our worksheets. We now have two. We have one for students and one with parents. On the student one, you're going to notice, I know you can't see this, but I will include the link to these in the follow-up email. We have a place on the students for them to put contributor information so they can gather that ahead of time and hopefully make the process a little bit easier. The parent form, we've added information about who needs an FSA ID, so they'll be clear right on that form. You know, do both parents need one? Only one parent? So we have separated those forms so that we can be more specific. And then on the back, it's the same information on just basically how do you create an FSA ID. Another more minor change to the FSA ID process is that every time an FSA ID is used, two-step verification will be required. That two-step verification, again, is when you log in using your FSA ID, that you then have to have a text sent to you with a code or an email sent to you with a code or use an authenticator app, okay? That has been the case for students. So when students have logged in with their FSA ID, they have had to do two-step verification, but parents haven't had to. Now, everyone, anytime they use their FSA ID, are going to have the two-step verification. And lastly, not for today, I've got more, but lastly, related specifically to FSA IDs, the people who don't have socials have never been able to get an FSA ID. So if we have new Mainers, you know, the students in many cases have a social, but maybe parents don't, they could still file the FAFSA because the parents don't have to have a social to file the FAFSA. But they couldn't get an FSA ID and they'd have to do a paper process to sign it. But coming soon, they will be able to get an FSA ID. We don't know how. We're still waiting for the details, but we understand those details are going to be released probably in August. So as soon as we have details on that, we will let you know. And that's going to be another good thing. We think that's a positive thing because that will avoid people having to print off signature pages and do all of that. All right.
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Does the person who starts the FAFSA need the Social Security for contributors or just themselves? But my question then is, what if they don't have the social?
Yeah. My understanding is it is going to ask for it, but I think they can proceed without it being provided. That's what I understand today, but that's a very tentative answer. So definitely hold tight. And as we learn more, we'll share more. Okay.
And just another quick cue, does only one parent need to fill out the FAFSA and get an FSA ID if they are in the process of getting divorced?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So if it's a situation where the parents are in the process of getting divorced, they're going to identify which parent is the parent on the FAFSA, the one that's providing more support, which is hard if they've just divorced, but take a good stab at it. Then only that parent will need that information, assuming that they're not remarried yet. Hopefully they're not, they couldn't be remarried if they were getting divorced, right? Okay. All right. So the IRS data retrieval tool is gone. Thank goodness, because that little bugger only worked about half of the time. So instead, what it's going to be is there's going to be what they refer to as the direct data exchange. This is why so many things are becoming more stringent. So when we talk about why does everyone need an FSA ID? Why does it have to be matched ahead of time? Why this and why that about the FSA ID, two-factor authentication each time? It's because of how they're obtaining data from the IRS. I could go into detail. I don't know that I get it, but there's a whole presentation I listened to last week about different types of, like there's FERPA rules and there's these rules. The IRS has their own set of rules, and those are the strictest of all of the rules. So currently, and Nikki did these little things on the bottom, which I love. So currently, the way that it was working is that even though we were using the IRS data retrieval tool, what was happening is the parent or the student was requesting that data. They were receiving that data and they were transferring it into the FAFSA. These will seem like subtle differences, but the significance is major, okay? So the information wasn't coming directly from the IRS. The parent or the student was basically an intermediary in granting that authorization. With the Future Act, if you think back to that was the one passed in 2019, it said basically that information is coming directly from the IRS. It is not passing, the parent and student aren't even going to see it. It's going directly into what they call the FTI, the Federal Tax Information Module, okay? So, again, I don't know that we really care to go into detail about this, but when you hear, why are these things happening? Why are there these changes? It's because of how that IRS information is being obtained. So this direct data exchange, everyone, well, there's one little caveat. Well, it's a caveat that applies to a lot of people, but everyone will need to consent to having their federal tax information, FTI, that's a term we want to get familiar with, imported into the FTI module. So what that means is when I'm a student filling out my section of the FAFSA, I'm going to see a box and I have to check that box to consent to my tax information being obtained and transferred into the FTI module. As a parent, I need to check that box in my section to authorize the transfer of that information into the federal tax information module. Okay. Now, back to who's required to have an FSA ID. If the parents are married and file a joint tax return, one parent can basically consent for both of them because they filed a joint return. But if they're a married couple and they filed separate tax returns, both of them not only need to have their own FSA ID, but they're both going to need to consent to the transfer of that information. Okay. So to provide consent, that individual will have to access the FAFSA, log in with their FSA ID, and it needs to be an FSA ID that's been matched with a Social Security Administration. So if they already have one, great. If they don't, they need to create that, let's say 3 days ahead of when they're going to use it. This fall, we're going to be doing a lot of FSA ID creations. That's the long and the short of it here. Federal tax information will be transferred into the FTI, not into the FAFSA, okay? So any of the federal tax information that's being transferred will not show up on the FAFSA. There's not going to be transferred from the IRS anymore. It just simply will not exist on the FAFSA at all. Instead, the federal tax information will go into this module. That's where the SAI will be calculated. That will be fed back into the FAFSA. But tax information that comes directly from the IRS will never be transferred back into the FAFSA. Fun fact for people who work in a financial aid office, and you probably have heard this now, there will be 2 files, 2 what we call ICER records being delivered to schools and to us at FAME. One that has the FAFSA data and one that has the tax information. And schools will have to match those up for individual students. Okay. So again, the changes as a result of this information coming directly from the IRS are really significant. Now, even non-tax filers have to check that consent box. Okay. The bottom line is there's a couple of messages that we just want to be sure everyone gets. And one of them is that everyone has to check that box. That's for everyone that's required to. Non-tax filers are going to check that box and it's going to verify that they're a non-tax filer. So that's great. This should help with verification, fingers crossed, right? If that consent box is not checked by everyone who's required to check that box, the student will not be eligible for federal financial aid. So if a student, does their FAFSA, they think, oh, I don't file taxes, I'm not going to bother with that consent box. The school gets their FAFSA, the school is going to say, you're not eligible. You might otherwise meet all the criteria to get a full Pell Grant, but you didn't check that consent box. They can go back in as a correction and check it. But what we want to get the message out is that everyone needs to check that box. Everyone that's required needs to check that box when they do their FAFSA. Otherwise, they're not eligible. Okay. All right. I have some happy news. Continuing on. So changes to income reporting, the long and the short of it is that basically the only income information that is going to be used on the FAFSA, or be used to calculate a student's eligibility in the FAFSA is going to be income information that comes from a tax return. So gone is that whole page. Of course, it's going to be reformatted anyway, but gone are all of the untaxed income questions. So untaxed income is no longer impacting financial aid eligibility and does not have to be provided. Again, the goal is to simplify the process. So the only income that is going to matter is income that is on the tax return, with one little caveat, okay? So untaxed contributions to retirement. I mean, this, we're talking about some things that are going to hurt families that are middle income potentially. This is going to help them. If they contribute untaxed income to a retirement plan, they had been listing that. They were supposed to have listed that on their FAFSA. They no longer have to. Workers' comp is not going to be on there. Any cash support or other money paid on the student's behalf, gifts from grandma, grandpa, that from a 529 or from wherever, had to be listed as untaxed income in the appropriate year. That's gone. None of that is required anymore. The one other little piece of income that doesn't come from the tax return that is still required is going to be child support receipt. That is still going to be reported on the FAFSA, but because there's no untaxed income section, it's going to be listed as an asset. So, doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's because there's no untaxed income section. All right, I'm talking to the good, the bad, the good, the bad. No longer will the parent SAI be divided by the number of children or students in college. So anyone who's been working with students for a year, familiar with this process, the EFC has been divided, the parent EFC has been divided by the number of students in college. That is not going to be the case going forward in the federal formula. Now, the question will still be on the FAFSA. So if you go ahead and you file a FAFSA and you're like, well, Mila said that wasn't going to count anymore, but that question is still there. Yes, the question is still going to be there. Schools can still use that. So a school can make a decision for their institutional funds that they want to count 2 in college or 3 in college, but it will not happen and is not in the federal formula. Interesting side note, we looked at our data. 73% of our FAFSA filers have only 1 in college. Okay, so conversely, what's that? 27% have more than 1 in college, just in case it's kind of helpful to know about that. Small impact on low income families. If your EFC was very low, no longer dividing it in 2 probably won't have a big impact, but a bigger impact on families who are higher income and have multiple kids in college. So we know that and here's the reason why, because this one is a big deal for people. The reason why, as I understand it, is a primary goal of this process was to be able to use the poverty tables to predict Pell eligibility early. What the poverty tables do not have in them is the number of kids in college. So you can't use those Pell tables to predict or calculate and determine Pell Grant eligibility because it doesn't have the number of students in college. So they had to remove that from the formula. So that's my understanding of why that change has been made. Just a few more things. We always referred to something called the simple needs test, which basically meant that people didn't have to provide asset information on the formula. They've changed the name of that to applicants exempt from asset reporting. Makes sense, but it's a mouthful. But here's what the takeaway is. People don't have to provide any asset information at all on the FAFSA, students or parents, if they receive any means tested benefit. If they receive WIC, SNAP, TANF, new this year, federal housing assistance, an earned income tax credit, there's a whole list of them. And if they receive any of those, they automatically do not have to provide any asset information. That's a standalone statement. Used to be an and statement. It's a standalone statement now. You get TANF, you don't have to provide asset information. Additionally, if you don't receive those benefits, but your income is less than $60,000 and you don't have any lettered tax schedules, or it's less than $60,000, you only have Schedule C, and you can see the caveat there, then you also don't have to provide asset information. So this is a big deal. We talk a lot about the importance of saving for higher education. People are hesitant to sometimes because they think it's going to negatively impact financial aid eligibility. But the reality is, here in Maine, at least, we have a significant number of families who are not required to provide any asset information. Currently, the income cutoff is $50,000, going to $60,000 next year. This one people don't like. In the past, when people did have to provide asset information, they could exclude a small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, as well as a family farm. Currently, they are going to have to report those. Now, that being said, there's a lot of pushback on this, and especially from the Midwestern states that have a ton of farms. as well as for people who are supporting small businesses. This may change, so hold tight, and when we get to the point that the FAFSA actually becomes available, we're going to want to be sure that everyone knows what assets count and what don't. But for right now, these are no longer excluded assets. Retirement is still excluded and primary residence is still excluded, but these two are not as things stand today. We're just about done. So when it comes to the verification and correction, good thing 'cause it's 2:00. When it comes to the verification and correction process, we don't know how that will look, but the good news is that students will be able to list 20 schools on their FAFSA, not 10. So hopefully that will help with having to do a correction. Verification will truly be random next year, not just for Pell Grant recipients. And the student aid report is going to become the FAFSA submission summary. Yes, Nikki.
Verification question real quick.
Yes.
This consent, the DDX consent, will
Yes.
that eliminate the need for verification of non-filing?
We don't know for sure. It should certainly mean that that's been documented. So that should not have to be documented. I was on a webinar yesterday where they asked some questions, and there's a webinar tomorrow I'm going to talk about momentarily that maybe we'll get the answer. So hold tight just for a second if you're interested in that. So if FAFSA is not available till December, we're going to focus on FSA ID creation. Watch for emails from us. We'll do FAFSA's help sessions starting after the first of the year. We have done our 10 tips, our 10 changes that are coming. We've also updated our website, and we will continue to. So if you go to baymaine.com/FAFSA, you can see FAFSA simplification information by clicking here, information on the 23-24 FAFSA, 24-25 FAFSA here. So we have that updated the website to reflect all of that information. Here is where you can find out a bunch of information directly from federal student aid. They have something called the Knowledge Center, and in the Knowledge Center, one of their topics is FAFSA simplification. These are live links, so you should be able to link from them when I send the information. If not, let me know. They have a roadmap as to when different pieces of information are going to be released. But what they are also doing, and especially for financial aid people, because this is who they're focused on, they're doing a series of like 10 webinars. There's been 3 so far. There's one again tomorrow, and tomorrow's is on verification and a few other topics. So you can go here and you can register for these webinars. They have the PowerPoints available. They are being recorded. So it's a great source of information, but that's how much content there is. I tried to take as much as I could and pack it into an hour. They're doing like, again, 10 of these sessions. I did want to highlight specifically on July 25th, they're doing the FAFSA demo. So that will be the first time any of us will see what the FAFSA looks like for the upcoming year. So if you have a chance to at least attend that one might be super interesting. We will be doing our summer training on August 15th. So you want to save that date. We put it in our end of the year email as well. More information will be coming on that. No doubt we will be talking about FAFSA simplification and some other topics at that point in time. So that's what I have. I'm sorry I went over by a couple of moments. I know that was fast and furious. It's one of those things where I had some things I took out. I probably should have taken out more, but I just wanted to get as much information to you as possible. Nikki, I'm happy to stay. So are there some things, and this is being recorded. So if you need to leave and you want to pick up the end later, you can do that. Nikki, are there any questions that we need to address before we end for this day?
Yeah, so I have some questions that came in that weren't at the time you were talking about them, and I assured folks that I would ask you, but I thought I have also captured them so that we could include them maybe in a follow-up email.
Perfect. Yes. Absolutely.
So will the change in the FAFSA open date change any of the application process for early decision schools? And I don't know if there's any schools on the webinar with us that might want to pipe in the chat and let us know. Have you heard about any change in the dates or the process?
Yeah, I think if schools want to chime in, that's great. Here's what I've heard so far is that early decision schools tend to be schools that also require the profile. That's not a hard and fast. So what we're understanding is that early decision schools may indeed change some of their dates, but may also rely on CSS profile information to kind of get them started in terms of their decision making. We have heard that some schools might look at adjusting their deadlines a little bit, but I think about the fact that forever the FAFSA didn't become available until January 1st, right? It's only been in the last, I think it was 2015, last 8 years or so, that it's been available earlier. So we do expect that there will be some deadline adjustments for schools that had really, really early December deadlines. But here in Maine, most of the schools have deadlines of, February and March. So I would just say the most important thing is for individual students and parents to just be sure they're checking the website specifically of the schools that they're interested in attending. In doing some of that, I'm not seeing any updated information, so that probably won't be there until the fall for many schools.
Yeah. The Pell, will that be prorated for students who are taking more than 12 credits? In other words, if someone's taking 15 credits, they won't get any more than the max Pell.
No, Max Pell is full-time. And so, yes, so the good news is that's 12 credits, not 15 for students who are, only taking 12, but for students who are taking 15, they're not going to get more Pell. No.
Okay. It sounds like the parent might be the best person to start the FAFSA. I feel like we might be leaning that way for a few reasons.
Yeah, this is one where we keep going back and forth on, and we don't know yet what we're going to recommend. So pros and cons. Parents starting the FAFSA, it benefits that they probably have their students' information, and so it's going to be easier for them to provide that contributor information. Also, if the parent's income is less than 60,000, or they answer yes to those mean tested questions, it means no assets are required, and so when the student gets to their part, they will already know that. Benefits of the student starting the FAFSA is if the student starts the FAFSA, much of their information, will be pre-filled. So it will be, pretty easy for them to get started. And it will determine their dependency status. So that's the only reason I'm hedging from having the parent start. I guess if the parent's not in the picture, then it would make sense. But if the student starts the FAFSA and happens to be independent, then of course they're not going to need any parent information. So we don't have a position on that yet. We'll probably do up a pros and cons list and share it with people because I do think it's going to be student specific. Yeah,
agreed. I was leaning towards the parents because they will most likely get the social security number correct, but that's Nikki, not necessarily Fame.
No. 100%. I know my kids don't know mine.
Yeah. I'm not sure my kids know my legal name. So there's that. So define parental support. When we say that we're going to list that parent that provides the most support, are we talking the biggest income or who buys the cleats?
Yeah.
Who buys those are the most,
parental support is not who earns the most money. It's who provides. You want to start thinking about things like who provides the housing, who pays for their food, who pays for their clothes, who carries the health insurance is another really big one. So basically, try to do a back of the envelope calculation on that if there's shared custody to figure out, when you think about all of those things, which parent is providing the majority of the financial support. But it will not necessarily be the parent that has the highest income by any means.
What will we do about, or I guess what would the process be for parents who have not filed a tax return but have, or that should, or maybe they just refuse to file taxes? Like if they give consent, the IRS will see that they haven't filed, but I'm guessing the IRS also gets W-2 information. So
I haven't heard what additional action, if any, will be taken. So what I understand today, or what I think we've heard today, is that if someone hasn't filed taxes, that information will be reported back to the school. But schools have never been responsible for determining, or making someone file a tax return. I mean, we can't do that. Schools can't do that. So I'm anxious to hear more about how that process is going to work. Now, one thing I didn't touch on is we're going to have times when people have filed taxes, but that their tax information is not appropriate to use for determining eligibility. And here's who I mean. We talked a moment ago about a married couple who's getting divorced. They're divorced today. So we're talking about they're divorced on December 31st when theoretically we're filing the FAFSA. The 24-25 FAFSA requires 2022 income. In 2022, they filed a joint married tax return. Well, because they're divorcing or divorced, it's not appropriate to use both of their incomes. It's only going to be the parent income for the parent that provides the most financial support. So there will be a way for them to manually enter income information. So there'll be a limited number of people for whom tax information isn't found, maybe due to identity theft, for example, or that's using tax information that's on file is not appropriate, that will be prompted to enter income information manually. But we have not seen exactly how that works and what the pathways are going to be.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, 100%.
2 more questions. IRS fraud, for those that have tax return fraud issues, have had an issue in the past.
Yeah.
This will no longer be an issue?
Well, we'll see. I think that for some of them, it might be fine if it's been resolved. I do think we're going to have people for whom the IRS, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'll see if I can pull it out when I send the email. I did see what the 4 codes are that they will return to the schools. So it's like taxes found, didn't file taxes, I believe there's one that says information, but it can't be shared. So I do think that people who have had their identity compromised, what the message will be to the school is that, yes, there is a tax return on file, but that it can't be shared. And in those cases, those families will be directed to input their income information into the FAFSA.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. Where can we find poverty line tables?
Oh, I'm going to send them to you. Yes. So that Pell lookup. Yes, that Pell lookup is basically the poverty table. So I am going to put that link into the email that I'm going to send you. My goal will be to get this to you. Should I under promise over deliver? I will have it to you in the next week. I hope by the end of the day Friday, but we have to do some behind the scenes things here to get everything ready to be sent out. So, but yes, I will include that in the email. Absolutely.
Great. That's all I have for questions.
All right. Wow. Thank you for all those of you who have hung in through all of this. If your head is spinning, I do apologize. It's a lot. it's a lot, and we will continue to do this, and we welcome your feedback on the best way to do this. You know, would it be helpful for us to have, like the feds are doing, you know, a series of shorter webinars with less content over the course of a couple of weeks when the fall starts? Or is it better just to put as much out there as we can, know that they're recorded, people can come back and listen. So we are very open to your feedback always, but specifically on how is it best for us to get information to you. We're going to try to do it in all sorts of different ways, but let us know because we're listening. Right. Anything more?
Good. Great job, Mila.
Well, thank you all so much. I wish you all a great rest of your day. And if you have questions, you know where to find us. You get the email. You can email me back with any questions as well. Okay. I'm going to stop recording.